Come on! Let's We got the teamwork to make the dream work. Let's go. Let's go. We're gonna make it this time. We're gonna take it home. Let's go. Let's go. Do it. Do it. Make it happen. Where there's a Mets man, you'll find a Mets fan. Let's go. This is a Mets year for all your Mets here. Let's go. Bring it home. Bring it home. Bring it home Make it happen. There's no stopping us now. We're gonna do it again. It's
What's up, Met fans? Welcome back to Talking Mets. Hey, Rob, how is everybody doing tonight on this Thursday, December 15th? A week away from Christmas. Waiting for the Mets to get some more presents under the Christmas tree to add to our lineup, add to our bullpen, to try to make this team better. That's where we are when it comes to the New York Mets. Unfortunately for us, the Correa situation almost happened, but the Giants went above and beyond with the amount of years to land Carlos Correa, and you cannot kill the Mets for not going that far. They came in late. They tried to get Carlos Correa, but they did not do it. And some could be mad. Some could say, well, he got back issues. Some could say the Mets missed out. But the New York Mets did make a competitive offer. 13 years is kind of crazy, but I didn't think the Mets had to go that crazy to get Carlos Correa. 13 years is a hell of a lot of years. And again, I think even if the Mets would have went that far, would people be mad? Would Met fans be mad about that? Probably not. But let's be honest. It would have been fun to see Correa wearing a Mets jersey and playing next to Lindor at third base and them two being together for the next decade, basically. It would have been a lot of fun. But we didn't get that. And now we move on to hopefully still getting that big bat. I know Epler was on TV the other day talking about they know they need another bat, possibly two bats. That's a possibility that we think was always a possibility, and now that we're hearing it from basically the horse's mouth that the Mets need another bat, it's clear that they're going after another bat. What type of bat? Who knows? We know the bats that are available. We know the possibility of getting those bats. And it's clear. It's JD Martinez. It's Trey Mancini, Brandon Drury, Michael Conforto. There's multiple free agents that could be a possibility when it comes to those type of players. And I know people are talking about trade scenarios. Some talks about Reynolds. You can always put him at left field if you trade him. If you trade from the Pirates. Some talk about Rafael Devers, but I want people to understand the fact about trading for a guy like. We'll start with the soon to be Rafael Devers. We all agree Rafael Devers is an all-star player, probably one of the best bats you can get at this moment if you trade for Rafael Devers. But you have to think the amount of prospects you have to give up for necessarily a rental player for just 1 year. Yes, obviously, if the Mets do trade for him and give up those prospects, they're going to do everything they can to make sure they extend him for a huge contract. That's a possibility. But there's no guarantee that Rafael Devers is going to sign an extension. He might still want to go on a free agent market and have teams bid for him as a free agent, and his price is only going to go up. So, there's no obligation for a player that gets traded in a contract year. If they get traded, there's no obligation to say that they have to sign an extension with that team that trade for him. So there's no guarantee on that. And number two, why give up prospects to get him now? And yes, some would say, well, you got to get him now because you don't know what could happen. He could get traded to a team, like it there, and then sign there, and then the Mets lose out of him as a free agent. True. But giving up those prospects and signing him to an extension, you basically you're losing your prospects to another team. Yes, you get Devers, but so you had to spend the money and give up the prospects when they're going to become a free agent anyway at the end of the year. That's something that you have to look into, and I understand that it would be absolutely amazing to get either Devers or Ohtani right now and put him in this lineup right now for the 2023 season. But I don't think it's a smart move to trade your top prospects, probably your top 2 or 3 prospects, for Ohtani or Devers. It just doesn't make sense. Because those players, if you want them, they're going to be available at the end of the year in free agency. It might not help 2023, but it will help the following year. So when you look at that, I think you got to forget Devers and Ohtani at least this offseason, because who knows what happens at the trade deadline. The prices might go down since it's only a half a year that you'll have them, and teams might get a little desperate to get rid of them to make sure they get something for them and not just let them go to free agency and get nothing at all. That's a possibility as well. But the most important thing is what can you do now that one is not going to affect your prospects? Again, even though I'm not a prospect hugger, it's stupid to give up your prospects when you have the possibility of signing them at the end of the year anyway. That's something that I don't understand unless it's at the trade deadline and you know where your team is in the first half of the year. You already played 80 something 90 something games and you kind of know where your team is. That's when you know how good your team can be at that moment, and you see their record and they're on the verge and they're one of the best teams in baseball. Then you could consider taking that risk of giving up some prospects for that piece that you need to trade for to make your team better and to help to put your team over the top. In the offseason, would Devers help the lineup? Absolutely. Would Ohtani help the lineup and the rotation? Absolutely. But there's to give so much and still got to pay these guys doesn't make sense. I'd rather just wait for them at the end of the year and then sign them just for money and still have the opportunity of keeping our prospects. But that's something that we would see. That's the reason why I think I'm not saying Correa was a end all be all, but it would have been nice to see Correa because nobody can really say, oh, if you get JD Martinez, Trey Mancini, Brandon Drury, Michael Conforto, any bat that you thought on the market that's available free agent wise, that is like in that middle tier of player, at least offensively, nobody in that middle tier is better than Carlos Correa. Again, not saying the Mets had to go 13 years, but if they could have landed Correa somehow, again, no Mets fans would have gave a damn about the years or about the money that was involved in that contract. All you would have saw is whatever number he would have wore and the name on the back of his jersey with a Mets jersey, the logo right in front of it. That's all we would have cared about. What does it matter, right? Me, as crazy as I am, I would have went to the MLB shop in the city and get my custom Correa jersey. I would do that. That would have been me. That would have been a lot of Met fans just being excited because of that. But it does not. It didn't happen. And you got to focus on the middle tier offensive players or DH possibility or guys that can play some positions but is more considered a DH. But, once in a blue moon, put him at first base, put him in left field, depending on who it is. Again, we already talked about the names. Again, none of these guys are going to jump off the mat. Whoever the Mets decide to get within the group of those players, there's going to be some fans that are mad that they went that route, some fans that are happy that went that route, or either the entire fan base is not happy and all the fan base is happy. And I don't think that's going to happen either way. It's going to be a 50-50 mix probably if the Mets say, you know what, we're going to have a reunion with Michael Conforto. There's going to be some fan base that's going to be pissed off. Why would we go back to this guy after what he did in 2021? Been out a whole year. And some would be extremely happy. You're bringing back Conforto. All right, that's great. But who can have the highest upside with the least amount of risk? Again, I don't think that anyone you get is going to be an extreme type of a biggest reward with the lowest risk. I think any of them are a risk, right? Conforto's a risk because he hasn't played in a year. The last time we saw him on a Major League Baseball field, he was terrible. But you also look at him that out of the 6 years of his career, 2021 was his only really bad year in Major League Baseball when he averaged over 20 home runs a season, averaging 75 to 80 RBIs. And let's be honest, if you look around this lineup, how many guys can do that production around 20 to 25 home runs, close to 90 to 100 RBIs or 85 to 100 RBIs in this lineup? It's not that hard to look in this lineup right now and see who would even be close to that production. Maybe Escobar, but what did Escobar at 20 home runs with like 60-something RBIs? Other than that, nobody was even close to what Michael Conforto had. And it was only a couple of years ago that, in 2019, Conforto had a really, really good year. It was one of his best years of his career. And 2020, a shortened season, which I don't really like to look at, but some thought it was his best season ever, even though it was only 60 games. I don't look at it that way. I go back to 2019. But, there's a lot of factors when it comes to 2021 with Michael Conforto. I don't know if it was the pressure of the contract. I don't know if it was I don't know what it was, honestly. He probably just put too much pressure on himself when he probably didn't really have to, when he just had to let his talent do the work. And that was something that Conforto, I think, put too much pressure on. But the people who don't want Michael Conforto, I'm not saying I'm totally against it, and I'm not totally for it either, because I'm not going to have any type of emotion either on the bad side or the good side, because Michael Conforto, I can't say he's going to be bad or good, just like anybody else you can get. But the difference with having Conforto in 2021 or 2020 or 2019 rather than right now is that you're not putting Michael Conforto in this lineup to bat 3 or 4 in this lineup, right? He is not the focus of this lineup. You are not counting on him to be the big producer. If you look at years past, even in Alonso's rookie year of 2019, they were still trying to have Conforto as that main guy, that middle of the lineup guy, that big run producer guy that we needed, that we had to rely on. We're not relying on Michael Conforto right now. He's basically, if you really go down the depth chart, 6th, 5th, maybe even 6th or 7th in the depth chart to somebody who's like, all right, if Conforto does well in this lineup, it'll make the lineup better. But we know who the guys are that we have to count on to have this lineup be what we expect it to be. We need Marte to be that guy. We need Alonso, Lindor, and we need Nimmo, right? You don't even have Conforto. Conforto's not going to be in your top 4 in the lineup. Possibly not even in your top 5. So you're not expecting him to be the major run producer that we trusted and counted on over the last couple of years. And that's where I think people are not really focusing on Michael Conforto. They're looking at him as that piece that can help this line get over the top. That's not what I see Michael Conforto as. Anybody you get is not going to be the savior of this lineup. Any of these guys that are available. But the higher upside when it comes to Michael Conforto compared to anybody else, JD Martinez, Trey Mancini, Brandon Drury, name your guy. I know there's a limit to what those guys can go. I know you might need a right-hander in this lineup. Some people prefer a right-hander. I do too. But what has the better upside, right? You got a guy in Conforto that's trying to establish his baseball life and career, right? In a show-me type of deal where he knows he's got to do something or he will probably never get a long-term contract. So you have that type of player in your lineup that is trying to show the teams or even the Mets that 2021 was a fluke, right? What is Trey Mancini at this point? Guy who hits for average. He doesn't hit for a lot of power. Is not a big run producer. JD Martinez, as much as the Mets fans wanted JD Martinez, last trade deadline, he was terrible. And when I mean terrible, he was disgustingly terrible in the second half last year. And you know what? Everybody who got traded, Josh Bell, bad. Right? Trey Mancini, bad. So these guys that got traded that we thought the Mets could look at with that big bat in the lineup at the trade deadline didn't really do well. The best guy out of everybody that really did well when he got traded was basically Brandon Drury. And let's be honest, guys, getting Brandon Drury, like if you think Brandon Drury is going to be that guy behind Pete Alonso that can protect him, you're fooling yourself. All right. There's a reason why there's not teams lining up to sign Brandon Drury or JD Martinez or Trey Mancini. You know why? Because they're not the same, especially JD Martinez and Trey Mancini. They're not the same players they were 3, 4, 5 years ago, right? Brandon Drury is what Brandon Drury is. He's a strikeout guy who hits home runs, right? Yeah, the Mets need home runs, but we also don't need a guy to strike out 200 times with men on base either, or 250 times either. And yes, Brandon Drury can play outfield positions. He can play a little bit of first base. So yeah, he does that. He has that versatility. Same thing with Trey Mancini. But what I like about Michael Conforto is the fact that he is somebody that if he can be anywhere near the player that we had for 5 out of 6 years on the New York Mets, there's a possibility of what we've seen in 2019. Even in 2020, put it this way, guys. If the Mets don't get JD Martinez, Trey Mancini, Michael Conforto, and they decide to go internal with Ruff and Vogelback and a mixture of Alvarez, right? Michael Conforto's worst year, which was 2021 as a New York Met, he hit 14 home runs. Right? 14 home runs. You know who hit that many? Yeah, Vogelback. Right? And Ruff, nowhere near that. You see what I'm saying? So even a bad year Conforto is considered a nice year for Vogelback. You see the problem that I have with that? Even if Conforto is 2021 Conforto, he's still basically what you had at DH than Ruff or Vogelback. And you know what? Conforto over the years got better hitting left-handers, and we know what he can do with right-handers. And oh, by the way, can play any outfield position you want at a pretty decent level. We know how good he is in right field. So you don't expect him to play right field a lot because of Marte, but you also know that Marte's getting older, so you don't want him in the outfield every single game. So Conforto can spell Marte on the field one day or 2 days, and you can put Marte at DH for 2 games. I like the whole fact that you can use Conforto in different parts of the outfield, give guys days off, and also use guys that you given days off of at the DH position, and that's something that you can use as well. So, not saying that, again, I think too many people are looking at Conforto as like, all right, this guy's going to be a 25 home run guy. This guy's going to be a huge run producer because, let's be honest, for the majority of his career, he was the guy the Mets counted on to be that run producer, that 25 to 30 home run guy. That's what they were trying. That's what they were focused in on when it came to Michael Conforto. You don't even necessarily need that. If you get that, it's a godsend. It's amazing. But you also got to look at the fact that even if you get 18 to 20 home runs, 65 RBIs, the Mets were nowhere near that when it came to the DH position or another productive bat in that lineup, because the Mets didn't have a problem getting on base. That wasn't their issue. It was the producing of runs, driving those runs in. That was the major factor late into August, into the whole month of September, when we had our easiest schedule. That was the problem. We could not drive in the runs. The runners were on base. I need guys that can get up to the plate, that can drive in runs, not just a guy that can hit for average. That's all nice and all, but we needed that other run producer. And when it came down to it, when it wasn't Alonso, when it wasn't Lindor, it was nobody else, because Marte got on base, Nimmo got on base. If Lindor and Alonso were streaking at that time and not as hot and not driving in those runs, when Lindor was cold, couldn't drive in those runners on base. Now it put more pressure on Alonso because Alonso knew there was nobody behind him 5 through 9 that could do that. So he was squeezing the bat a little tight up, trying to hit a 3-run home run every single time at bat when he had runners on. That's something that we need to avoid, right? We need to avoid having Alonso and Lindor being the main 2 producers in this lineup. Like I said, they are the major factors when it comes to run producers, power, or hitting 25 to 30 home runs or more. And Lindor is that guy that you expect to hit 20 to 20, around 25 home runs. But if you don't have anybody else that you can count on as a run producer, then when those guys get cold during the season, which every offensive player does, you need that other bat that you can count on. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't think a 36-year-old JD Martinez, who looked absolutely old and terrible in the second half, is going to do that for a guy who doesn't hit home runs like he was 3 or 4 years ago. Yes, he hit a lot of doubles last year, but other than that, his average went down dramatically over the last couple of years, lower than his career average. His power went down drastically, and his strikeouts went up. So, yeah, JD Martinez's name sounds nice, but he is nowhere near the player that he was even 2 or 3 years ago. And that's my concern. The same thing that goes for Trey Mancini. Trey Mancini wasn't even in the lineup for the majority of the games during last year's playoffs for the Astros. Once he got traded there, he struggled so badly during the rest of the season that he wasn't even starting in a lot of the games. Yeah, he was getting some pinch-in appearances and a start here and there, but he wasn't even a big factor in them winning the championship. And these are the two guys that everybody's clamoring for. And that's why I put up a poll on my community page yesterday of which bat I said, since Correa is off the board, which bat would you consider the Mets to bring in? Conforto, Martinez, Mancini, Drury, right? Conforto was winning, and that's not a shock at all. As much as Met fans, some of them can't stand him, he is the best option because the upside could be tremendous. Could be that same Conforto we saw in 2019, in 2020, and even in the early parts of 2021 until he struggled the rest of the year. Because that bad Conforto in 2021 is better than any DH person you had in 2022. Like, it's not even close. Like, you can't even combine JD Davis, Dominic Smith, Vogelback, and Ruff RBIs, and it's not even more than the 63 RBIs that Conforto had in 2021. So even 14 home runs and 60-something RBIs is a hell of a lot better than what we had in 2022 at anybody you put in that DH spot. Again, not saying that it is the answers, because it's not. The answer was to probably try to get Correa or get one of those other free agents that were a big bat, right? But you didn't get them. So you got to focus on what's available, because I don't believe the Mets are trading for Devers and Ohtani. It's stupid to do that, because if they weren't willing to give up prospects last trade deadline, when the team was one of the top three teams in baseball and were contenders for a World Series, and you weren't willing to give some prospects up to make your lineup better and your bullpen even better, then why do it in this offseason when you bring back basically the same team or the same lineup with, some might say, a better bullpen than last year and a rotation that can be solid as last year or even better than last year, and you wouldn't do it then, but you're going to do it now in the offseason? That don't make no sense to me. So don't expect a trade for Devers or a trade for Ohtani. If you're waiting for that, you're going to be hugely disappointed. So that's not where you have to look. You got to look at the mid-tier players that we just talked about and do your pros and cons. Again, it's a what have you done for me lately? And the guys that we haven't seen every day on a daily basis, like the reason why a lot of Met fans don't want to see Conforto back, because they've seen him on an everyday basis struggle in 2021. What people don't see, you're not watching JD Martinez every at bat, Trey Mancini every at bat, Brandon Drury's every at bat. So you don't know. You might see, oh wow, look at the doubles he had, but look at him. If you watch him on an everyday basis, and if you talk to Red Sox fans and let them tell you about JD Martinez, they'll tell you that he's probably shot. Trey Mancini, I mean, we watched the playoff series with Houston. He was barely in a lineup, but when he was, he struggled. So until that's why we have that what have you done for me lately mentality with Michael Conforto, but completely forget what he did in not even a couple of years ago, where he was one of our best offensive players in our lineup. Not saying much, but you know what? When he was consistently hitting over 20 home runs, nobody was complaining and playing tremendous defense. But one bad year turned a lot of Mets fans sour. So I'm just saying, don't necessarily sour on the door of Michael Conforto, because the versatility in the outfield and the possibility of upside with Michael Conforto, who is younger than all of the guys that we just talked about, and has basically the most, I would say, reason to stay. Basically, this is basically his show me type of contract. You give him the 1 year deal, and who the hell knows if he struggles to the point where he looks as bad as he did in 2021. There's no long-term extension coming from Michael Conforto. This is his chance to get it. I know he turned down $100 million, but you know what? Most players would have, considering what he's done in his entire career. You know, nobody could have expected, and I don't think any Mets fan would have probably predicted that Conforto was going to have a year like he did in 2021 after every year of his career being a very good player. All right, so let's see. I know everybody is in the chat right now, probably cursing me out, which is always interesting. But, you know, Ken wants me to talk to the loyal subjects. Yeah, Mothman, the Mets are not done in this offseason. I mean, you had Epler say it twice in a week that they know they need bats. They're going after at least one, possibly two. So that's something. Well, yeah, Christopher, I understand realistically, yeah. But if you, again, the people who I saw people putting in the chat, Devers or Ohtani, get that out of your mind. Again, if they're not going to trade guys, prospects, for a team last year at the trade deadline that was top 3 in all of baseball, that were top contenders for a World Series, and not give any top 25 prospects to get better in this lineup, why the hell in the world would they trade possibly 2 or 3 of your top prospects for Ohtani and Devers? They're not doing that, especially when they can have them next offseason. It's just not happening. Sorry. As much as they will help us this year, they're not doing that. And if they do that, it's stupid. Yeah, Met fans be excited because it's Devers and Ohtani, but then you're looking down the road. All right, so great. If we get Devers. So now we have no really good top prospects left in our system. And we got to pray that we have another good draft, which we had last year, and pray that those prospects can quickly move up the ranks. It's not happening, guys. I'm sorry. It's just not happening. Rudy, the Yankees are not the better team at all. Like I said, if the Yankees were in a real league that were actually had good teams, again, there was only 2 teams in the American League that were actually really good, and it was the Yankees and the Astros, because the American League was terrible. 100-win team in the American League when you had 3 in the National League. Come on. The Yankees are not that good. I mean, seriously, like, they're the same team that they've been the last couple of years. They overachieve in the regular season and fall apart in the postseason. That's what they were. You know, you gave your GM another 4-year extension. You signed Aaron Judge, not because you needed him, because Hal realized how much money he was going to lose in jersey sales and ticket sales if they would have lost Aaron Judge. Again, if you gave Hal Steinbrenner truth serum, I can assure you, if you told him, was it a baseball decision or a business decision? 100% it was a business decision. He knew how much money he was going to lose in jersey sales and ticket sales if the Yankees lost Aaron Judge. That was the reason why Cashman didn't go past $320 million. It took Hal Steinbrenner to call from his boat in Italy and he basically begged Judge to come back. And he got lucky. That's all it was. It wasn't like they paid him the most money. And again, it seems the same thing with Yankee fans that just want to believe that it's World Series or bust when they're basically a team that, yes, makes the playoffs every year, but let's be honest, is it really that hard to make the playoffs every year in a terrible American League and a terrible American League East? That the competition was bare, because before 2 years ago, who was really good in that American League East? The Rays were the only team that was actually challenging. The Orioles are terrible every year. The Blue Jays just started to actually look like a team. And the Red Sox, besides a year where they win the World Series, they're usually terrible every year as well. So the Astros had an easy road to the World Series. They just had to make sure they got to the World Series and won it. The Yankees barely got out of the divisional series against a team that they should have wiped the floor with. So that just shows you how bad they actually were. And look what they did in the second half. They were terrible, right? They had nearly the entire lineup playing way above the stats on the back of their baseball card. And that's not shocking because did anybody expect Trevino to be any good? No. He had a really career half a season, and then they all came back down to the back of their baseball cards, which, if you look at it, are terrible. Except for Judge. Again, if it wasn't Judge on that team, you're lucky to win 70 games. All right? I mean, Judge's WAR, I think it was like close to a 10, and it's probably more realistically. So, again, Yankee fans are always going to think they're the best team. They're World Series or bust. You can't be World Series or bust when you haven't won since 2009, right? I don't hear Met fans. I don't even hear myself saying World Series or bust when it comes to the Mets because that's just idiotic to say. And you know what? The Astros should be saying World Series or bust because at least they won in the last 6 to 7 years, and they can say that. You know, the Brave fans can say that because they just won. The Philly fans who just made the World Series can say, all right, we got to the World Series. Now it's World Series of get to the World Series and win it. Realistically, if you haven't been there in 13 years, there's no reason why you should say that. And that goes for Met fans as well. You know, in 2015, nobody believed that the Mets had the best team to get to the World Series, but they almost had a chance to win. That doesn't mean it's a World Series or bust the following year or every year after that. That's stupidity to me. So at the end of the day, we know what the playoffs are, right? The playoffs are basically this. Get in and anything can happen. It has become the NHL playoffs. That's like my best line that I probably ever came up with. The Major League Baseball playoffs is like the NHL playoffs. If you get in, anybody can win a Stanley Cup. If you get in Major League Baseball's playoff, you can win the World Series. It's very simple. And it's not that hard to figure out that the best team does not even make the World Series most times anymore in Major League Baseball, especially in the last 5 to 7 years. It's not, you know, our parents' Major League Baseball. It's not even our grandparents' Major League Baseball anymore. It comes down to it's a crapshoot now. And that's the way it is now, right? If somebody would have told you on July 1st that the Philadelphia Phillies would, 1, make the playoffs, 2, get to the World Series, we would have laughed all the way to the bank, right? I would have put money on those odds. And that's the whole thing right there. Just because the Phillies got hot exactly at the right time doesn't mean all of a sudden they're the best team in the National League. And no, Michael, they're not. Well, okay, but Bryce Harper's not healthy. And again, last time I checked, you still haven't done anything to your bullpen. That same bullpen that was a little bit better in the playoffs was that same bullpen that was absolutely garbage in the first half. See, people seem to forget that. You have an ace in Wheeler. You can't say nothing about that. Wheeler, ace of the staff. Again, Philly fans fought me last year when they wanted to, overhype Nola to be their ace, and Nola's far from an ace, right? Nola is a good pitcher who has gems every now and then, but leaves a lot on the table many times during the year. That's not an ace. So he's a fringe number 2. And Walker, again, Philly fans, I watched him for 2 years, every game. I'm telling you right now, Walker's a good pitcher. He'll have his gems. But he had a 3.5 ERA with the Mets in a big ballpark. He gave up a lot of warning track fly balls that will easily be out in Citizens Bank Park. Be careful with that. Again, not saying Walker's a bad pitcher. He found that split finger. That was a big key to his success. But every year in the second half, he broke down a little bit. You know, he had a well under a 3 ERA after the when the first half ended, and he struggles in the second half badly. Well, Michael, I know that, but stop. But see, that doesn't see. That's the whole thing with you Philly fans. And again, I gave the Phillies a ton of credit for doing what they did, but let's not act like it wasn't what it was. They got hot at the right time. They were never the best team. That's why I'm like they're the best team in the NL East. That's idiotic. You made one move that was big with Turner, which I think is going to really help the lineup, especially a team that hit a ton of solo home runs last year, right? Turner's going to get on base. That's going to help run production, absolutely. But just because your lineup's murderer's row, you also have to pitch as well. So if you score 8 runs, why can't the team you face score 9 runs? If your pitcher's not on caliber with what your lineup could be, because your rotation is not that good. Let's be honest. Again, you can trust Walker as your number 3. Walker was never our number 3. He was our number 4. So a 3.5 ERA is exceptional when he's your number 4. But when you're counting him to be the third guy in your rotation, you know, your third guy in your rotation is a guy who throws a lot of innings, you know, is like a stopgap in certain situations. That's the whole issue when it comes to the Phillies. And Walker is not that guy. Walker's a nice pitcher. I think he fits better in a Mets team than he does the Phillies because I think Walker is more successful in a bigger ballpark. And when you play half your games in a bigger ballpark, your ERA is going to show for it. Right? And you're playing in a smaller ballpark now, which we all know Citizens Bank Park is a bandbox, and fly balls go out of there, especially in the left and right field sides of the field. And again, all you have to do is watch Walker every day. He'll pitch his gems. You know, he'll give up home runs and a lot of fly balls to the warning track, especially at Citi Field or in big ballparks. When you get in the Citizens Bank Park, it's bad. And I decided to check Taijuan Walker's stats in Citizens Bank Park over the last 2 years. Well over a 4 ERA at Citizens Bank Park. Pitches well at home at Citi Field against the Phillies, but at Citizens Bank Park, terrible. So if he's going to pitch more often at Citizens Bank Park and his ERA is over 4 when pitching at Citizens Bank Park, that's a problem for you guys. So you haven't fixed your bullpen. The guy that you traded for at the deadline is now a Met. And the same guys that were terrible in the first half pitched a little bit better in the second half and pitched pretty well in the playoffs. And then when it got to the World Series, the guys you counted on to get there completely fell apart. That's why you lost the World Series, right? You stopped hitting home runs and your bullpen wasn't good. That's a recipe for disaster. And before the Phillies can claim that they're the best team, right? The Braves weren't the best team when they won the World Series. They got hot at the right time. The same thing with the Phillies. You can't have 87 wins and claim you're the best team in baseball or the best team in the National League. Yet you were the best team because you got hot, and you're called National League champions because you got hot at the right time. But you weren't the best team. That's not fair. It isn't. Because the only team they had to face, remember, they avoided the Mets, they avoided the Dodgers. 2 teams, the Padres beat both of those teams. So at the end of the day, the Padres should have been the best team because they beat 2 of the best teams in baseball when the Phillies only had to face one of the better teams in baseball in the Braves. So they had an easier road than the Padres basically because they had to face the Mets and the Dodgers, right? But just because the Phillies made the World Series doesn't mean that they're the best team. Well, again, you know, On paper, yes. But at the end of the day, the Mets had the same record as the Braves. They won on a tiebreaker. So it really doesn't matter about do you consider them better on paper. Yeah, you can look at the Braves lineup and say, well, yeah, clearly they're better than the Mets. But the run differential was not much at the end of the year, right? The Mets were scoring more runs than the Braves for the majority of the year. The Braves runs different. The Mets and the Braves runs weren't that much of a difference. The Mets were still in the top 10. Like, it's not like the Mets, completely were, offense was non-existent. SG, I keep my last name under wraps because it's not the best thing to say. Just put it this way: I'm Irish. That's it. That's basically it. So think of an Irish last name. and there's another thing. Why is nobody talking about the possibility of the Braves losing Swanson? Like, who are they going to fill him with? Even if they fill him with a rookie or a guy that's not proven, like some believe it could be Grissom. All right, you put Grissom at shortstop. Why do you just assume that he's going to have the same production as Swanson? Well, by the way, a leader of your team that I just spoke about the last live stream, right? No Brave fans wanted to, talk about the leadership that Freeman brought to that Braves team, that Braves dugout. People push that away and like, oh, Olsen's going to have better stats. Okay, that's fine. But when you get punched in the mouth, where's that leadership that's going to say, all right, guys, it's okay. We got this. We are a good team. But when the Braves got punched in the mouth in the NLDS, they couldn't recover because their leadership was gone. And now Swanson was somewhat of that leader as well, but he wasn't that veteran leader like Freeman. But Swanson was one of the leaders. So you're removing, if Swanson don't come back to the Braves, you're losing two big components that helped you win a World Series in 2021. You're taking that off the team. Who's going to be your leader? Acuna, who is a me guy and is not the same player ever since the knee injury. Ozzie Albies could be that guy. I like Ozzie Albies. But who is it? Is it Austin Riley? Maybe. But he seems like the guy who shows it on the field and not like a big rah-rah guy. And a guy that can calm things down when things don't go right. I don't see anybody else that can be that guy. Again, did they get better with Sean Murphy? If you lose Swanson, isn't that kind of like an even swap? You're not necessarily getting better. And the big problem with the Braves last year, for the majority of the year, was their lineup was a huge strikeout concern. And that changed a little bit with Sean Murphy because his bat-to-ball ratio is a lot higher than almost everybody in that lineup. So contact-wise, and they're going to have a little less strikeouts because of Murphy. But other than that, there's still a big, huge strikeout team. And you saw what happens when when they actually hit home runs and they don't strike out as much as when they win. You can look at the games. You can look in even when they were really hot from June 1st all the way to the end of the year. The games they lost, they struck out a ton. They couldn't hit home runs. When they didn't hit home runs in those games, if they didn't hit multiple home runs in a game, they lost that game. So is that a sign of a good team, or is that a sign of a team that when they get hot, they're hard to beat? There was a lot of times last year with the Mets, and nobody likes to talk about it, but a lot of times last year when the Mets lineup was cold, but they would scratch a couple of runs together because they were more of a put the ball in play, see what happens type of deal. And those led to some errors, and they got on base with some walks, and a lot of their on-base guys got on, and there was a couple of errors that got us runs in. Even when the Mets were cold, they were finding ways to win ball games. When the Braves didn't hit home runs, they lost. The same thing with the Phillies. Look at their records last year. When they hit multiple home runs in a game, they were at an 83, I think it was 83% pace of winning the ball game. The same thing for the Braves. I think the Braves were a little bit higher, like 87%, when they hit multiple home runs in a game. When they didn't, they lost more times than not. And the Mets were never a home run hitting team last year. Yet they still won the same amount of games as the Braves, and they won 14 more games than the Phillies. So there's no exact science onto how to win 100 plus games or how to win a World Series or be good in the playoffs. It's who gets hot at the right time. That's the most important thing. And, as much as everybody likes to talk about, Harper was out a lot of the time for the Phillies. Oh, but look, Acuna didn't come back until late May, early June. Or I think it was like late May. Oh, that's great. But why don't I hear any other fan base, the Brave fans or the Philly fans or just a objective baseball fan? Well, the Mets didn't have Scherzer and the Mets didn't have DeGrom for combined 16 weeks of the season, which is more than half. They didn't have their number 1 and number 2. And most of the time last year, they had David Peterson and Trevor Williams in that lineup with Bassett, Walker, and Carrasco. That's not a rotation you want to go to war with for the majority of the year. But yet, the Mets still won ball games with that rotation. And on top of that, their most dynamic player last year, everybody can say probably was their best offensive bat overall. That was one of the linchpins, was one of the spark plugs of this team, was out the whole month of September in Starling Marte. But nobody wants to talk about that. The most crucial time where the spark plug of that lineup was Starling Marte. He was probably your MVP of that lineup because he did everything for that team. And Marte was out that entire month. Again, that's not an excuse because the Mets should have won games despite Marte because they played a lot of bad teams. But let's not act like Marte wasn't a huge part of this Mets offense the entire year. And you take them out of that. And on top of that, the guy that you brought up to help Escobar and Guillermo when they were injured, Beatty was also hurt. And then Escobar started to provide the offense that we do all year. So the lack of offense we got from Escobar, DH, and catcher when the Braves were getting production from every part of the lineup, yet they still won the same amount of games as the Mets when the Mets had no offense from DH, catcher, and third base the entire year. So nobody wants to bring that part up. But when it comes to, the Phillies didn't have Harper. The Braves didn't have Acuna. Well, okay. And parts of the year, they didn't have Albies. But what if the Mets, out of those 16 weeks without DeGrom and Scherzer, what if they had 4 more weeks of both of those guys in the rotation? The Mets could have won 106 games, don't you think? Maybe they would have won 1 or 2 more games, or maybe even 3 more games if those guys were a little bit more healthier during the year. Right? That's a lot of ifs, but you can't bring ifs up with other teams and then completely blow past the Mets ifs if that was the case. That's the issue that I have with everybody. Yet, everybody wants to kill the Mets and, put the Phillies on this pedestal and act like the Braves were better, but yet nobody in the NL East had more big injuries as a whole on their team than the New York Mets. But nobody wants to bring that up. Yet the Mets still won 101 games. Let me ask you, in the Braves rotation and the Phillies rotation, did they have a Trevor Williams type that was in that rotation who was basically our number, when the season started, our number 8 starter on the depth charts, who was starting games while on the West Coast? Because that was when Scherzer just got hurt, right? When the Mets were about to go on the West Coast. So it's not painting one team better than the other. Because if you just look at the teams on paper, you can just say, well, of course the Mets don't have the best lineup. Well, yeah, that's understandable. But if you look at the Mets lineup and the on-base percentage guys that the Braves and the Phillies don't have, then those solo home runs mean absolutely nothing. And the ton of strikeouts, the Braves and the Phillies blew past the Mets on total strikeouts through the year. And it's not painting the picture of, the Mets are here and everybody else is here. No, because that's not fair to the other teams. But don't act like a team that won 101 games is completely worse than the team that also won 101 games. And don't bring the Phillies on a pedestal because they made the World Series when we've talked about the playoffs being a complete crapshoot now, that the best teams don't even make the World Series sometimes and don't even win the World Series. So again, every team still needs work. The Braves, at this point, there's talk about them trading Max Fried, their ace of the staff. And I mean, come on. You hear Brave fans still talking about Soroka, who hasn't been healthy in 2 years. There's no guarantee he's going to be in the rotation. So Max Fried, who struggled in the playoffs in the World Series year of the Braves in 2021, wasn't a very good pitcher in 2021 in playoffs for the Braves. So they won despite him. And in 2022, he was terrible in the playoffs again. Spencer Strider never pitched so many innings in his career. Broke down at the end of the year. So we're putting the Braves on this pedestal when their rotation is a little bit in shambles as well. And their bullpen that was supposed to be so good, which were dominant in 2021 in the playoffs, weren't as good last year. That basically did not help them in the playoffs at all. And if you really look at it, at least the Mets address their bullpen, and they're still going to address their bullpen. I can argue that the Mets bullpen is better than it was last year, just based on the fact that the Mets never really had someone you can trust. Even though Ottavino became that guy later in the year, for the first couple of months, there was no bridge to Edwin Diaz. Like, every time we were like, who's going to be our 8th inning guy? Like, for the first couple of months, it was sometimes Lugo, sometimes Ottavino. Hey, how about Trevor May? And then injuries happen, and then look at that, right? So, but the Mets now have that bridge to Diaz. We know the 8th inning guy is David Robinson. We know the 7th inning guy is most likely Riley that we got from the lefty from the Rays, amongst other guys that can be, your 6th inning guy if the guy only goes 5 innings. And that's not including Drew. I was just going to bring up Drew Smith. Drew Smith, is a wild card. He's a guy that if he's April Drew Smith, well, now we're really talking about something. But if he's, injured Drew Smith, or Drew Smith that came back after injury, who was giving up home runs left and right, well, guess what? Then that's not going to be so much fun. But the Mets bullpen, they addressed the needs that they had. And I still think the Mets are going to bring back Ottavino. They bring back Ottavino. They got 4 guys in that bullpen that is very trustworthy. And that's not including if the Mets go out and get Chafin. Riley had one good year. Why should we count on him? Because Todd, he's a veteran who the Mets are getting him as a lefty specialist, which the Mets really didn't have last year. I mean, Joely Rodriguez was in the bullpen, but there was a lot of times he gave up big home runs to lefties and wasn't as good as he should have been against lefties. Riley dominates against left-handed hitters and is actually not that bad against right-handers as well. Right-handers are hitting 235 against them, and lefties are hitting a little over 100. So it wasn't just one good year. You're looking at it in the wrong direction. Liam Hendricks, you got to trade for. That's not going to be cheap. So it's important to understand that the weaknesses of teams in our division, just the NL East alone, did that team fix their weakness? I don't necessarily think everybody fixed it as of yet. For the most part, like the Mets struggled, even though the Mets bullpen wasn't as bad as people want to make it out to be, there were struggles in the later parts of that bullpen. Well, again, Ron, that's depth move, Jose Peraza. It's a depth move. Don't worry about that. That's another guy possibly could be a minor league depth guy or a possible bench guy who could play multiple positions in the infield. So, did the Braves, the Braves got Sean Murphy, right? the Braves lineup is already very good. So how much better does Sean Murphy make that lineup without Swanson if they don't re-sign him, right? At catcher, yeah, Murphy's going to be better than Darno and Contreras throwing guys out, but it's not like they were complete garbage behind the plate. So how much did they really gain, right? The Braves haven't really done. I know they made that one move for a bullpen arm, but other than that, they struggled. I mean, who's their closer, right? And who's their bridge guy? Who's their seventh inning guy? The Braves need some help in that bullpen. The Phillies, right? Walker is good, but again, they're counting on him to be a number 3, and I don't see that. I don't see Walker being a number 3, especially in that ballpark. So, if anybody's saying, "Oh, look at this team, the best team in the NL East," well, why don't you focus on the weaknesses? Because too many times, Met fans, Brave fans, Philly fans focus on the strengths and only worry about the weaknesses when they actually see it and it hits them in the face. And like, wow, that bullpen is really bad. Or wow, the Mets don't have that power that they need. Or in the Brave sense, oh, wow, that team, wow, look at that bullpen. That bullpen wasn't as good as last year. Look at that, right? Yeah, Iglesias, I agree. But the funny thing with that, Luis, and thank you for bringing that up, right? They had Iglesias ever since the trade deadline, yet they still went with Jansen even in the playoffs, and which made no sense to me because we all knew that Iglesias was dominant when he came to the Braves, and they still used Jansen as the closer for the majority of all of last year in the second half and even in the playoffs, which makes no sense. And yeah, Iglesias can step over to that closer's role now, but now that Iglesias, who was basically shut down in the 7th and 8th inning, is now your closer. So who's filling that void that Iglesias had for you guys in the 7th and 8th inning? Now, who is that? They haven't really replaced those holes that Iglesias filled easily to the bridge to Jansen. Because there was a lot of times when the 7th and 8th inning was the innings that you needed to shut down that lineup. And we've seen it in the Mets Brave series at the end of the year. It wasn't necessarily the 9th inning that was, the end all be all to win that game. It was actually the 7th and 8th inning, and Iglesias was pitching in those innings. And that's a big deal. And I think that's going to be something that the Braves need to address. If they don't address it, how can you just say that, yeah, they're a good team? Absolutely. But when you don't focus on the weaknesses, and then when you're watching these teams and you're like, wow, they're really missing something here. As much as the Phillies get in Trey Turner, right? Even without Trey Turner, that lineup was dangerous. So it's not like the lineup is going to be 100 times better, because they're also not going to have Harper for about 2 months, maybe longer, depending on when he can come back from that Tommy John surgery. So it's always interesting to me to just look at the positives, and then from other teams, and like people were saying in the chat, oh, the Braves are better than everybody in the NL East. Oh, the Phillies are the best team in the NL East. Well, where's your reasoning? Because if you only bring up the lineup, that's wonderful. Congratulations. They can score 8 runs, but their pitching can give up 9 runs. And that's including rotation and bullpen. You see the problem with that? And that goes the same thing for the Braves. They're another team that was beating up people with their offense. But once again, the Mets, who have none of that crazy power that the Phillies or the Braves have, but yet the Mets somehow won 101 games with the lack of power bats. So what can you say is better to make it happen again? I like teams that don't strike out a lot, and the Mets in the NL East struck out a lot less than the Braves and the Phillies. I like that more. Yes, I would like more power. But if I have to rely on power to win ball games, that's a recipe for success during the season. When you face good pitching every single day in a short series in the playoffs, 9 out of 10 times the pitcher is going to win that battle. You saw what happened. Look at the World Series. The World Series, the first 2 games, the Phillies were hitting home runs, right? As soon as they got to game 3, the last couple of games, 3, 4, 5, 6, was the last 3 games, they struck out 51 times. They could not hit home runs. And when they did, it was only solo home runs. So it wasn't damaging. That's what happened to the Phillies. As soon as they stopped hitting home runs, which was the blueprint all year for the Phillies, when they couldn't hit home runs, they didn't win. The same thing that went for the Braves. And that's why when you're only a home run hitting team and they didn't produce a lot of runs other than home runs, obviously they hit doubles, they hit singles, they drive in RBIs, of course, but the majority of their runs scored was the home run ball. And that's when you have to worry with just big power hitting teams. And if at any moment home runs can go away like that. And we've seen it time and time again, right? We see the perfect example was the Yankees all these years, right? They got all these power hitters. They had the same exact hitters throughout the entire lineup. And you've seen it time and time again. Then when they got to the playoffs and faced better pitching on a everyday basis in a short series, those home runs slowly went away. And they couldn't recover because they don't have guys in the lineup that can put the bat on the ball, let the defense work, possibly make errors. If they weren't hitting home runs, they were losing. And that's exactly what happened to the Phillies. They were hitting home runs early, in the playoffs during the first couple of rounds, and then the home runs went away in the World Series. And there was no way the Phillies were recovering from that because they didn't do nothing else other than hit home runs. The majority of their runs were home runs. And if you look at the Braves World Series championship year in 2021, look at the home runs they hit in each series. They consistently hit the home runs. And they got those home runs in the World Series, got those home runs in the CS and the DS. That took them over the top. Now, is that a recipe for success? Well, it was for 1 year, but they brought basically the same lineup back the following year with, some would say, a more better offense with Olsen and Harris, and they didn't win. So what does that tell you? It doesn't matter what you have every single year. If it's power, if it's a little bit of power, a little bit of gap-to-gap hitters, doubles hitters. Again, if your lineup gets hot at the right time, anything can happen. It's just, how long is that hot streak going to last? Because the Phillies were the hottest team in the playoffs, but that fire ran out in the World Series. So if you can extend that hot lineup throughout the entire playoffs into the World Series and keep it going like the Braves did in 2021, and oh, by the way, in the Nationals did in 2019, who both were nowhere near the best teams in baseball in those 2 years, stood hot the entire time. If there's one cold spell, you're losing a series if you're counting on one thing. And that's the difference in the playoffs nowadays. It's get hot at the right time, your lineup, not necessarily pitching. If your lineup gets hot at the right time and you can drag it into the playoff throughout the entire playoffs into the World Series and it stays hot, you have a chance to win. Because there's no way that a cold lineup at any moment is going to drag your team over the finish line in either a playoff series or a World Series. It usually doesn't happen. All right, so I'm just going to end it in a few minutes, guys, because I got something. I got to talk to some people. I remember I talked about the other day about a show that I'm going to be doing with about 2 or 3 guys. Going probably around, I would say sometime around the middle of January when we get closer to spring training. We're going to do a weekly special show, like a Mets weekly type of thing, going through spring training, through the season and all that. Once a week we'll be doing it. I'm talking to people right now that I'm going to have a little bit of a quote unquote meeting after this on video chat, just to see everybody's schedules and how we can fit it in, where we can get a group together in a show once a week for you guys, so we get difference of opinions and ideas, and make that channel a little bit more dynamic, and that's, I think, is important as well. So again, the offseason is not over. There's still a lot of decent free agents out there, middle of the road bats, bullpen arms that could make any team better, specifically in the NL East. We'll see what happens. There's a lot of offseason left. But let's not just look at a piece of paper and say, well, this team's better than that team, because it means absolutely nothing. Nobody can say that. Why did the Braves struggle all year against the Phillies, who weren't really the best team all year, but the Braves struggled against the Phillies, and it showed in the playoffs, but the Mets dominated the Phillies, but the Phillies made the World Series? How does that make sense, right? Because the way the matchups worked well, the Mets matched up well against the Phillies. The Braves didn't match up well against the Phillies. That's all it was. It comes down to matchups and if you get hot at the right time. That's what we have to look at, not during the season, because the season is such long and drawn out that, everybody's going to have hot streaks. Everybody's going to have cold streaks. It's just a matter of right now with the balanced schedule, it's not exactly what you do in your division anymore. It's going to come down to, all the teams in your division now are playing the same teams throughout baseball. So the Braves, the Mets, and the Phillies, the top 3 teams in the NL East, are playing all the same teams throughout the entire year. So the balanced schedule is going to make it a lot more even, because let's be honest, the Braves, the Phillies, the Mets played the Yankees more times than the Phillies or the Braves, right? Just because of the rivalry situation, right? That's not really fair. That 2 games that we could have faced, I don't know, a bad team instead of the Yankees 2 more times could have mean the difference of the Mets winning the division or not, right? So a balanced schedule, I think, is going to make it a lot more fair in your division, even though you face your division a little bit less in this new balanced schedule. There's no the Mets are facing the Yankees 4 times this year and the Phillies this year are not, because the National League East is not playing the American League East this year, right? But no matter what, the Mets are always facing the Yankees 4 or 6 times a year. So, and yes, Fulmer is an option as well in the bullpen as well. He's also a free agent. I think the Mets are going to be looking more of the Chafin Ottavino route, but Fulmer's not a bad option either. He's been very good in the bullpen ever since he got moved there with Detroit. So once again, guys, I'll keep you posted on the show that I'm going to put together with a couple of guys. These are people that I know from the 7 line, that I know are baseball guys that, yes, we definitely have difference of opinions, but it is different opinions. And these are guys that know the Mets, know baseball. They're biased. Look, every fan's going to have their bias for their team, but what I've known them to be, they're extremely fair. We criticize our team, and I don't think you can criticize other teams until you learn how to criticize your team. And I think I criticize my team more than enough, and I think you guys know me by now, that I criticize my team a hell of a lot. And I think if you can criticize your team and critique it down to the bone, you can start critiquing other teams. So I think the guys that are going to be on this show, I trust to give fair, unbiased opinions. Again, you might not agree with it because it is an opinion and you might have your own, but I like remember, it's Mets Weekly, right? It's going to be a weekly Mets show about, especially during the season, the recap of the week of games, right? So it's not like we're going to be talking about, like in the offseason, this team's better, that team's better. We're not going to really go into that detail with players. We're just going to be like, all right, what happened this week? And we're going to discuss and go over the following week into that next week of games. So again, we're going to be talking about it. And I think I'm getting a text for these guys now, actually. All right. So we're going to get going with that. And once I get everything figured out and we come up with a show name, I'm going to have these guys on. Excuse me. I'm going to have them on. We're going to I'm going to make them introduce themselves and talk about, how they became Met fans and, whatever they want to talk about themselves, so they can introduce you to them, themselves to you, and then we'll go from there, and then we'll have a good time weekly when it comes to that show. So with everybody, thank you for tuning in to Mets Hot Stove Live. Let's see if the Mets get one of those mid-tier bats that they desperately need in this lineup, and let's see what else they can do to improve this bullpen. So with that said, thank you for tuning in to Mets Hot Stove Live. Before you go, don't forget to please hit on that like button, and don't forget, guys, you can share the stream, share the channel to your social media pages. Let other Met fans know that say, hey, come join the channel, see how you like it, and that's how we grow this channel. So with that said, guys, everybody have a good night. Let's go Mets, and I'll see you next time, guys. Have a good night.
You'll find a Mets fan. Let's go. This is a Mets year for all your Mets here. Let's